Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was a late afternoon when I wandered down the familiar streets of my old neighborhood. I had returned for the first time in years, after leaving for the city, looking for some sort of closure I didn't really know I needed. The familiar streets had changed, new shops had popped up where old ones had once stood, and the once quiet corners now buzzed with a different kind of energy. But there was something strangely nostalgic about being here again. The scent of wet leaves, the distant sound of children laughing, and the old trees still lining the sidewalk, it all felt like stepping into a memory. I was walking past the park when I heard it, the soft, delicate notes of a melody floating through the air. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the chatter of people passing by, but it stopped me in my tracks. I turned, searching for the source, and saw him, an older man sitting near the edge of the park. His back hunched slightly as his fingers moved across the keys of an old piano accordion. The notes he played were clear and haunting, cutting through the noise of the city. I stood there for a moment, listening to him. The melody was unfamiliar at first, a simple tune that seemed to float like a breeze in the air. But then, as I focused on it, I recognized it. It was my childhood lullaby. I couldn't remember the last time I had heard it. My mother used to sing it to me every night before bed. The gentle, calming rhythm would always soothe me, easing me into sleep. And now, here it was, being played by a stranger, in the middle of this busy street. The fact that he was playing it so flawlessly, the same tune, brought a strange knot to my stomach. I hadn't thought about that lullaby in years, hadn't even realized I still remembered it until I heard it now. I walked toward him, drawn by the music, though a part of me wasn't sure why. He was sitting on a simple wooden bench, the accordion cradled in his hands, his head bowed slightly as he played. His face was weathered, his clothes old, but he played with such care, such devotion, as if he were performing for an audience. The gentle notes seemed to envelop me, tugging at something deep within me, something buried long ago. When I was close enough, I hesitated. There was something eerie about the scene, something unsettling in the way the music seemed to resonate with a memory I hadn't touched in so long. I stood a few feet away, watching him play, unsure if I should say something. The man didn't acknowledge me. His eyes were closed as he played, lost in the music. I felt a strange unease crawl up my spine as I listened. After a few moments, the song shifted. The notes became slower, more deliberate, the melody softening into a lullaby-like cadence. It was exactly as I remembered it, the same gentle rise and fall of the notes, the soft, comforting pattern that once lulled me to sleep. But as the song played on, I noticed something. It wasn't just the melody that felt familiar. The notes themselves seemed to be growing more personal, more intimate, as though the song was speaking directly to me. I could hear my name woven into the melody, the faintest echo of it in the music, just beneath the surface of the tune. I blinked, unsure if I had heard it correctly. I took a step closer, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something strange. The man's fingers, his hands were moving in a way that didn't quite match the music. They seemed to twitch, to move too quickly, too erratically. But when I looked closely, they were back to their steady pace, as though nothing had happened. I stopped in front of him, my heart pounding now. I wanted to speak, to ask him why he was playing that song, why it felt like he was trying to reach something deep inside me. But my throat felt tight, as if the words wouldn't come. Finally, the man stopped playing, his fingers resting lightly on the accordion. He looked up at me slowly, his eyes pale, almost unnaturally so. There was something empty about his gaze, like he wasn't truly seeing me. His mouth curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You remember it, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. It was as though the music had opened something inside him, something that had been waiting for me to notice. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My throat had tightened so much that I could hardly breathe, let alone speak. "I've been waiting for you to hear it," he continued, his smile widening. "Waiting for you to come back. It's been so long." I took a step back, my mind reeling. "What do you mean?" I managed to say, my voice a little more shaky than I intended. The man's smile never faded, but his eyes seemed to darken. "The music was always meant to call you back. You didn't remember. Not until I played it. But now you do." A chill ran down my spine. There was something deeply wrong about the way he spoke, the way he seemed to know things I hadn't told anyone. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. I looked around, but the park had become strangely quiet. The people who had been walking by were gone. The benches were empty. It was just me and him now, in the silent, still park. "You don't remember it, do you?" the man whispered, leaning slightly toward me. "You don't remember the nights when the song played, when you fell asleep, when you never woke up?" My stomach twisted. The memories flashed through my mind, fragmented and disjointed, but I couldn't piece them together. My childhood had always felt like a distant dream, faded by the passage of time. Yet, in that moment, the pieces began to fall into place, and a terrible realization crawled up from the depths of my mind. I remembered the lullaby, yes, but I also remembered the strange feeling of being watched, of never truly feeling alone, even in the quiet of my room. The man continued, his voice like a thread pulling at my mind. "The lullaby didn't just lull you to sleep. It kept you in the dark, kept you in this place." I stumbled backward, the air around me thick with the growing dread. "What do you mean?" I gasped, the weight of his words sinking in. He tilted his head slightly, and the smile on his face twisted into something darker, more unsettling. "You weren't meant to leave, but now you're here, and you remember." The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though the earth itself was shifting. My head was spinning. I reached out for something to steady myself, but the world around me seemed to warp, to blur at the edges. The music began again, faint at first, but it grew louder, sharper, more insistent. It was the lullaby, but now it felt wrong. The notes echoed with a strange, distorted quality, as if they were being pulled from somewhere deep and dark, a place that didn't belong to the world I knew. The man's figure seemed to blur, his smile stretching impossibly wide. "You've been asleep for so long. It's time for you to come back." The world around me began to fade, and I reached out, trying to hold on to something, anything, but the music, the lullaby, wrapped around me, pulling me in. I felt myself slipping, my body becoming heavy, my thoughts clouding, until all that remained was the music. And then, nothing. The street was alive with the usual evening bustle, but something felt off that night. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched a little too far, or how the lights above flickered just a second too long. It wasn't that anything had changed at least, not visibly, but there was a subtle unease in the air, a thickness in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite place. The hum of the city, usually comforting, seemed louder now, pressing in on me from all sides. I had been walking aimlessly, just letting my feet carry me through the familiar streets, lost in thought. The corner where the street performer usually set up was just ahead. He was always there, the same man, dressed in ragged clothes, his guitar slung over his shoulder, a colorful scarf wrapped around his neck. His performances were small, but always lively, and they brought a sense of warmth to the otherwise cold streets. People would stop, drop a coin in his hat, and move on. But tonight, as I neared the corner, I could hear his guitar, the notes more haunting than usual, carrying through the air. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, watching from a distance. He was sitting on his usual crate, but something was different tonight. There was no crowd gathered around him, no one watching, just the streetlights casting long shadows over him. He was playing his guitar, but there was an odd heaviness to the music, a sadness that made the air feel thicker, colder. And then, he stopped. The music faded into silence, leaving only the distant hum of the city. I waited for him to start again, but he didn't. Instead, he set his guitar aside and stood up slowly. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was something unsettling in the way he moved, deliberate, slow, as if every motion carried a weight I couldn't understand. He turned toward me, his face obscured by the mask he always wore. It was a simple thing, white, with painted features, a soft smile that never quite reached the eyes. He had worn it every time I'd seen him, and it had always felt like part of his persona, part of the performance. But tonight, as he stood there, facing me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He reached up slowly, his gloved hands moving with precision, and took off the mask. For a second, I didn't understand. I stared at him, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The face beneath the mask was familiar, too familiar. It was my face. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same pale skin. His expression mirrored mine, exactly calm, but distant, as though he weren't really seeing me, just looking past me. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. My breath hitched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the face before me. The mask he had removed still hung loosely in his hands, but his expression had not changed. It was still mine. It was me. But it wasn't. I took a step back, my legs suddenly unsteady, my mind reeling. I wanted to speak, to ask him why he looked like me, why he had my face, but the words wouldn't come. I opened my mouth, but all that escaped was a shaky breath. The man, or whatever he was, stood still for a moment, just watching me. There was a strange calmness to him, as though he were waiting for me to understand something I hadn't yet grasped. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. He raised his hand, and I saw the faintest twitch of a smile cross his lips. But it wasn't the kind of smile I recognized. It was colder, sharper, like the smile of someone who knew something I didn't. Something that was impossible to comprehend. His lips parted slightly, and in the quiet, I could hear his voice, low and almost gentle. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a mirror of mine, but somehow softer, detached. It wasn't my voice. Not exactly. I nodded, my throat tight. "Why? Why do you look like me?" The words felt like they came from someone else, as though my body wasn't quite in control. He tilted his head slightly, the smile never leaving his face. "It's not about looking like you," he said, his voice still that strange, disembodied reflection of my own. "It's about being you. You've seen me before, haven't you? Just like this. You've walked by. You've dropped coins in my hat. You've watched me for so long, and now, you're here, standing before me." It was inevitable. The words didn't make sense. They twisted in my head, pulling at something I couldn't quite grasp. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the city suddenly too large, too suffocating. How had I never noticed him before? How had I never realized? "I am you," he said, stepping closer now, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if the air around us had thickened, becoming impossibly close. "I've always been you, but you've never been me, not really." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears. The street was empty now, the sounds of the city muted as if the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of us in this strange, liminal space. His figure loomed larger, as if it were swallowing me whole. His eyes, my eyes, seemed to pierce through me, pulling something from the depths of my mind that I didn't want to see. "You've been running from this moment," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "But now you're here, and I'm here. And we both know what's going to happen next." I turned, my legs moving before my brain could catch up. I needed to get away. I had to leave. But my feet felt heavy, like the ground itself was resisting me, like the city was closing in around me. Every step I took, the air seemed thicker, more oppressive. The faint, distant hum of the streetlights above flickered, as though they were blinking just for me, just for this moment. I glanced back once, and he was still there, standing in the same spot, his hand now resting at his side, the mask held loosely in his grip. The smile on his face was wider now, more knowing. I couldn't understand it, couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing with sickening clarity. He was me, and I was him. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel it. The world around me felt distant, out of reach, as though I were being pulled into something I couldn't escape. The mask, the face, the voice, it was all mine, and yet, it wasn't. The lines between us were blurring, and I was caught in the center of it. I ran. I didn't look back. My feet pounded against the pavement, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still there, watching me. And when I closed my eyes later that night, lying in bed, I could still hear his voice in my head, echoing, "You've seen me before, and now, you'll always see me." And in the dark, when I thought I was alone, I would catch glimpses of him in the corners of my vision, his smile, my smile waiting, always waiting. The evening had settled in slowly, like the quiet descent of a forgotten dream. The streets were empty, save for the occasional passerby, wrapped in their coats and walking with hurried steps, as if they had somewhere to be. I had come to this part of the city for a reason. though I couldn't remember exactly what. It was one of those strange, hazy moments when you're walking, but don't quite know where you're headed. The streets felt like they were closing in, like the buildings, old and weathered, were watching me as I made my way down the sidewalk. The clock tower at the center of the square had always stood tall, its presence a constant in the cityscape. I'd seen it countless times, watched its hands ticking away the hours, feeling comforted by its rhythm. But tonight, something about it felt off. The air around the square was thick with a strange tension, and as I glanced up at the tower, I felt the familiar weight of time pressing on me, almost suffocating in its stillness. I slowed my pace, watching the tower's hands move lazily across the face, just as they always had. But tonight, they didn't seem quite right. They were ticking slower than usual, dragging along the clock's face as though the seconds themselves were reluctant to pass. I couldn't explain it, but it made my stomach tighten, like the very air around the square had become heavier, laden with something I couldn't place. I heard her before I saw her. She was standing near one of the benches, facing the clock tower. She was tall, her figure almost blending into the shadows of the evening, her face obscured by the hood of her coat. At first, I thought she was just another passerby, another silhouette in the gathering dusk. But there was something about hers, something off. The way she stood so still, so purposeful, I couldn't look away. Her fingers twitched slightly, then slowly extended toward the clock tower, as though she were pointing at something, though I couldn't see what. Her hand was trembling, just barely, as if the motion took an effort that didn't seem to make sense. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak, watching her as she pointed at the tower. And then, in a voice so quiet that I almost didn't hear it, she spoke. "It's counting down," she said, her tone calm, almost detached. I felt my heart skip a beat, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I blinked, unsure of what she meant. The clock tower's hands were still moving, but they were slow, far slower than they should have been. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds growing longer, each tick filling the space around me like the slow beat of a drum. I couldn't stop looking at the clock, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The numbers on the face of the tower were the same as they had always been, but there was something wrong with the way the hands moved, as if they were going backward. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard, and when I opened them again, I saw it. Numbers on the clock weren't static. They were changing, rearranging themselves, each tick moving closer to something. But to what? To what, exactly? I turned to the woman beside me, my breath catching in my throat. She hadn't moved, hadn't taken her hand away from the air, still pointing at the clock with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Counting down to what? I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding far too small in the stillness. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly lowered her hand, but her eyes remained fixed on the clock. Her lips parted, and she said something that made my blood run cold. To the end, she whispered, so softly that I almost thought I imagined it. But I didn't. The words were clear, and they echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. I turned back to the clock tower, my eyes wide, my pulse hammering in my chest. The hands of the clock had stopped moving completely now, frozen in place. The numbers, those same familiar numbers, had twisted into something different. They weren't just hours or minutes anymore. They were symbols. Strange, unfamiliar shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. And at the center of the clock, where the hands should have been, was a dark hole, like an emptiness that stretched into the very core of the tower itself. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring up at the tower, my mind racing with impossible thoughts. It felt like time itself had warped, had folded into something unrecognizable, and the air around me felt suffocating, pressing down on my chest with a weight I couldn't escape. And then, slowly, the hands of the clock began to move again. But they didn't move forward, like they should have. No, they moved backward, ticking in slow, deliberate motions, each second reversing the flow of time. The numbers changed again, this time faster, shifting with unnatural speed, rearranging themselves as though they were trying to tell me something. The woman beside me finally spoke again, her voice distant, almost as though she were speaking from far away. "It's happening," she said. "The countdown has begun." I felt my legs go weak, my body trembling. I wanted to run, to get away from this place, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the clock tower, from the way the hands ticked backward, from the numbers that now seemed to pulse, growing more intense with each passing moment. And then, just as I thought I might lose control, the clock tower stopped. Everything was still. The air was thick, and the shadows stretched long across the square. The woman had vanished, disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the silent tower. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, laden with a presence that didn't belong, that shouldn't have been. I took a shaky step backward, my heart racing. The streets, the square, the city, everything around me had become too quiet, too still. I reached for my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but when I looked at the screen, it was blank. No signal, no time, no connection to the outside world. I turned toward the clock one last time. The hands were still, but they weren't just still, they were waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for me. The countdown had begun, and I had no idea what it was counting down to. But I knew, with every fiber of my being, that whatever it was coming. The park was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels too still, too complete. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the well-worn paths. The trees were a mix of green and amber, their leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. I had walked this park countless times, finding comfort in its peacefulness, in the way the world seemed to slow down once I stepped onto the paths. Today, however, there was a heaviness in the air, an unusual stillness that made my chest tighten. I had no particular reason for being there. It was just a break from the usual rush of life, a moment to clear my head. I found an empty bench beneath an old oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching wide above me, and sat down. I let out a long breath, allowing myself to settle into the silence. It felt nice to be away from the noise, from the constant hum of the city. But even as I sat there, something in the atmosphere felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't a bad feeling, just unusual. I looked around, watching the few people who passed by, a jogger here, an elderly couple there. Everyone seemed to have their own quiet, peaceful purpose. lost in their thoughts, their movements a gentle rhythm against the stillness of the park. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint trace of freshly cut grass, the scent of fall creeping in. I shifted slightly on the bench, trying to shake the odd sensation creeping over me. I glanced to my side, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. There, beside me, on the edge of the bench, was my shadow. But something was wrong. My shadow didn't look quite right. It wasn't simply the usual dark outline of my body. It was more defined, more present. It seemed to stretch a little further than it should have, its edges jagged and sharp against the ground. I blinked, trying to shake the thought. Shadows don't change. They're just there, reflections of light. But the longer I stared at it, the more I became convinced that something was wrong. The shadow wasn't behaving like mine. It was as if it had its own will, its own life. The edges of it flickered slightly, almost as though it was being pulled in a direction that wasn't in sync with my own movements. I moved my hand, watching as my shadow mirrored me, but there was a delay. A slight, almost imperceptible lag. I raised my hand higher, and as I did, my shadow didn't follow immediately. It seemed to wait, to stretch and bend in ways that didn't match the curve of my arm. When I stopped, my shadow didn't catch up right away. It lingered for just a moment longer than it should have, twisting and flickering against the bench. My breath quickened. This wasn't right. Shadows were supposed to be nothing more than an absence of light. But this one wasn't behaving like a shadow. It was too solid, too deliberate. I pulled my hand back, my fingers trembling. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the park remained empty, still. No one paid attention to the figure sitting on the bench. No one seemed to notice the strange way the light shifted around me. The few joggers and walkers who passed by didn't glance in my direction. I felt alone, utterly alone, with my increasingly odd shadow. I slowly turned my head to look at it again. My shadow was still there, beside me, but now it seemed to stretch further. It crept up the back of the bench, curling around it, as though trying to reach up and embrace me. I felt a cold shiver slide down my spine, my heartbeat quickening. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And then it happened. My shadow moved. It wasn't a natural movement. It didn't follow my body's lead as shadows are supposed to. It wasn't simply a dark reflection. It was something separate, something that had its own life. The edges of it rippled, the shape of it stretching in ways that were impossible, bending unnaturally around the armrest of the bench. It slid over the surface of the bench, as though it were trying to get closer, to sit beside me. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the shadow seemed to grow, reaching out with a dark tendril that hovered just at the edge of my leg. I jumped back, startled, my hands gripping the bench as I stood up. But as I moved, the shadow did too. It didn't shrink back into its usual place, as it should have. It followed me, its form warping slightly, its edges twisting with an almost deliberate malice. I turned quickly, looking around once more. The park remained empty. No one was close. No one seemed to notice. But my shadow was still there, lingering beside me, bending in ways that no shadow should. I started to walk, hoping that by moving, I could escape its grasp. But it followed me, its shape stretching and moving unnaturally in the dimming light. With each step I took, the shadow matched my movements, but it was never quite in sync. It seemed to lag behind, twisting and pulsing, as though it were alive and somehow out of step with me. I stopped at the edge of the path, my breath shallow. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the park, to find my way back to the streets, back to somewhere normal. But as I stood there, looking at the shadow that now sat beside me on the bench, I knew I couldn't leave, not as long as it was there. It was no longer just a reflection of my movements. It had its own presence, its own mind, its own will. It was watching me, pulling me in, growing more defined with each passing second. I looked around one last time. The park had turned darker now, the sky nearly black with the weight of the evening. The lights from the street lamps flickered overhead, casting long, faint shadows across the path. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, a sense that something was closing in around me. But no matter how far I walked, no matter where I went in the park, the shadow stayed with me. It never left. It followed me like a second self, a dark twin, that mirrored my every move. I couldn't escape it. The shadow was always there, beside me. And as I stood, trembling in the center of the park, I realized one terrible truth. It wasn't just my shadow anymore. It was something else, something that had latched onto me, something that had no intention of ever letting go. It was just another quiet evening at the museum. I had finished my work for the day, the city outside slipping into its usual evening calm. The museum was closed to the public by this hour, but I sometimes liked to stay afterward, wandering through the exhibits, taking in the familiar surroundings before heading home. The gallery was nearly empty at this time, the echo of my footsteps the only sound that accompanied me through the halls. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow that made the place feel both comforting and distant. The walls, lined with portraits and sculptures, seemed to watch over me, the stillness almost unnerving in its perfection. I had worked here for years, and there was something peaceful about the museum after hours. The absence of crowds, the slow rhythm of my thoughts as I lingered in front of the exhibits. I often found myself drawn to the older sections, the ones filled with artifacts from distant lands, centuries-old sculptures, and paintings that had stood the test of time. Tonight, I decided to visit the newly installed Wing-An exhibit, showcasing ancient relics from Egypt. The room was dimly lit, the artifacts displayed under glass, each one carefully positioned, each piece a testament to a lost civilization. As I moved between the cases, my mind wandered. I admired the craftsmanship, the detailed hieroglyphs carved into stone, the glint of gold artifacts illuminated by the soft lighting. Everything was pristine, frozen in time. I paused in front of a large statue of an Egyptian god, its stone, eyes staring down at me with an intensity that I couldn't shake. The air felt cooler here, and I was momentarily lost in the quiet, the feeling of being surrounded by centuries of history. That's when I noticed her. At first I thought she was just another visitor, though the museum was supposed to be closed. She stood at the far end of the room, near the wall, her figure partially obscured by the shadows. Her back was to me, and she appeared to be staring at something in the corner of the exhibit. She was tall, dressed in a simple coat, and her hair was long, dark, flowing down her back. There was nothing particularly odd about her, but something about the way she stood there, so still, made me uneasy. I watched her for a moment, unsure of why she didn't seem to belong in this quiet place, but I thought little of it. I was alone in the museum, after all. It wasn't unusual to feel a little unsettled in the darkened corners. I turned away, thinking I'd continue my walk through the exhibits, but then I heard something, a faint, distant sound, the softest scrape of footsteps moving in my direction. I turned back, and she was closer now, standing just a few feet away from me. Her eyes met mine for a brief second, and I could swear I felt a chill run through me. There was nothing striking about her appearance, but her presence felt wrong. Her gaze held mine for a moment longer than it should have, but then she turned, walking slowly past me, toward the far side of the room. I stood there, frozen for a second, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. She hadn't said a word, hadn't made a sound, yet her movements were too deliberate, too quiet, as if she were aware of my every step. I glanced toward the cameras positioned around the room, expecting to see the usual red light blinking, signifying that they were recording, but the cameras were all turned off. I frowned. It was unusual, perhaps a technical issue, I thought. I walked over to the security panel to check the system, but there was no sign of any malfunction. The cameras were powered on, and everything seemed normal. Yet, when I turned back to check the woman, she was gone. The room felt emptier now, colder, as if her presence had erased any warmth from the space. My breath quickened. I glanced around, but she was nowhere to be seen. I moved toward the door, scanning the corners of the room, the dark hallways beyond, but she was gone. The silence of the museum felt too complete now, suffocating. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease that had taken root. I had to be imagining things. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. Maybe she had been just another visitor, gone now, forgotten. But the feeling lingered, a knot in my stomach, as I walked back toward the security room. As I walked through the hall, I noticed something strange. The air was colder here, and there was a distinct smell, almost like damp stone, faint but unmistakable. I reached for the door to the security room, only to stop. Through the small window in the door, I could see her again. She was standing by the monitors, staring at them, her back to me, motionless. I blinked, confused. The monitors in the security room were supposed to show the camera feed, but she was blocking the view. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. The museum was closed. There was no one else here. How had she even gotten past the security gates? I decided to approach her, my steps slow and deliberate. But as I reached the door, she turned suddenly. Her face pale and expressionless, her eyes locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. Without saying a word, she stepped aside, as if allowing me to pass. I hesitated but pushed the door open, the sharp sound of the door creaking filling the otherwise silent space. The security panel lit up as I entered, but the woman wasn't in the room anymore. I checked the cameras, the monitors, scanning each one for any sign of her, but there was nothing. No trace, only the empty hallways, the deserted exhibits, and the quiet hum of the system. I checked the timestamp, and it was as if she had never been there. Confused, I sat at the desk and pulled up the footage. I fast-forwarded to the point when I had seen her, the woman in the coat, standing at the far end of the exhibit. But when I reached the time I had witnessed her, there was nothing. No person, no shadow, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. My skin prickled as I replayed the footage over and over again. No matter how many times I checked, the same result. She wasn't there. The cameras hadn't seen her. The footage was blank. It was as though she had never existed. I stood up, my head spinning with the weight of the bizarre occurrence. The museum was empty, still, silent, as it always was after hours. But the strange feeling didn't go away. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong, something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. I didn't leave the museum. That night, I stayed locked in the security room, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I had. But as the hours stretched on, I felt it, the presence of her, the woman, still watching, still waiting. And no matter how many times I checked the cameras, no matter how many times I left the security room to search the darkened halls, I couldn't find her, but she was there. I could feel it. And when I finally left the museum the next morning, the doors opening to the fresh light of day, I knew one thing for sure. The cameras never saw her because she wasn't supposed to be there, but she had been, and I had seen her. The market was bustling when I arrived, the usual sounds of haggling voices and the clink of coins echoing through the air. It was an outdoor market, set up in a square in the middle of the city. And though I'd been here many times before, something felt different that day. The air was warmer than usual, and the late afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden light that made the colors of the produce and fabrics stand out in sharp contrast against the older stone buildings that surrounded the square. Yet, despite the lively atmosphere, there was something about the market that unsettled me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I started at the far end, as I usually did, making my way between the stalls. The vendors greeted me as they always did, calling out the prices of their goods, inviting me to take a closer look at what they had to offer. The first stall was full of fruit apples, oranges, grapes bright and glossy under the sun. The second had handmade pottery, delicate bowls and mugs, all crafted with intricate patterns. As I continued, I noticed that the market's usual diversity seemed absent. Each stall seemed to sell a version of the same thing, but each with slight variations, almost as if the items had been carefully chosen for some unknown purpose. It was subtle at first, easy to brush off, but as I walked deeper into the market, the feeling began to grow. At the third stall, I stopped. The vendor smiled at me, a wide toothy grin that was just a little too forced, like he was trying hard to be welcoming. He didn't speak, just pointed to the neatly arranged bundles of salt in varying sizes and shapes, each pile as white and crystalline as the last. My eyes moved from one bundle to another, the piles stacked with precision, the grains sparkling like 100 tiny diamonds. I felt an odd pull to them. There was something comforting in the symmetry of it, something hypnotic about how perfect the piles of salt appeared. But I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I was just tired, I thought. It was a hot day. Still, something about the stall didn't sit right with me. I moved on, but the feeling lingered as I passed the next few stalls. The salt vendor was not alone. It was as if each vendor had only one product to sell, one that appeared innocuous but repetitive in nature. The next stall had more salt, the same pristine white crystals in perfect rows. The stall after that. Salt again. I felt a strange discomfort ripple through me. I walked faster now, eager to move beyond the rows of uniform goods. But the more I walked, the more the stalls seemed to blur together. Every one I passed was selling some variation of salt. There were the large blocks of it, almost like sculpted monuments, then smaller, bagged packets. Each one the same salt. Salt, salt. Salt. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that the vendors were simply catering to the market's demand, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The world around me seemed too still, too focused on the salt. My steps quickened, but the stalls stretched endlessly in front of me, and when I turned back to the beginning of the market, it wasn't where I had started. The familiar landmark of the old well in the center of the square had disappeared. The rows of stalls now surrounded me like a maze, salt on every side. I moved down another row, my mind racing. The vendors were still smiling, still pointing to their goods, but their faces had begun to blur, their features too smooth, too uniform. They were watching me now, waiting for me to make a choice, to pick from the endless salt. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, and the air was thick with something I couldn't place a heaviness, as if the whole market had become suffocating in its repetition. I tried again to leave, to walk beyond the stalls, but the rows continued to stretch, growing longer and more uniform with each step. The market had become a distorted reflection of itself, a place where nothing was different, nothing could be altered. I turned again, my breath shallow now, and realized that I had been walking in circles. The salt was all I could see, all I could think about. It was everywhere. At the far end of the market, I saw something different for the first time, a stall that was not like the others. The sign hanging from it was barely visible, obscured by the thick fog of salt in the air. But when I approached it, I saw what was on display: glass jars. Each jar contained a single, perfectly round stone, the kind that you might find on the beach, smooth and dark. But in the center of each stone was something strange, a tiny figure, as if trapped within. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I drew closer, I saw it clearly, a tiny human shape carved into the stone, so delicate, so detailed. I froze. My hands reached out involuntarily, fingers brushing the glass. The figures in the stones were not just carvings, they were alive, or at least they had been. The tiny forms in each jar seemed to shift as I moved, their heads turning slightly, their eyes blinking, their mouths opening in silent cries. The vendor watched me closely, his grin still wide and too perfect. "Take one," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's only a small piece, but it's all you need." I wanted to step away, to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I couldn't stop looking at the jars, at the figures trapped within. The weight of their silent pleas pressed against my chest. I couldn't breathe. The vendor's voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent. "Take one. You've been looking for something, they will show you the way." Before I could respond, a strange tingling sensation ran through me, like an electric shock, and I suddenly felt disoriented. I reached out toward the nearest jar, my fingers trembling, and just as I touched the cool glass, everything shifted. The market, the salt, the vendors, everything began to blur. The air grew heavy, and the once clear boundaries of the square melted away. the rows of salt began to dissolve into mist, and the figures trapped in the stones seemed to reach for me, their tiny hands pressing against the glass. The sound of their silent cries grew louder, pulsing with an unbearable intensity. I tried to pull my hand back, but it wouldn't move. My body felt as though it were being drawn into the stone itself, as though the figure within it were calling to me, drawing me into its trap. And then the lights flickered. I blinked, and the market was gone. I was standing alone in a completely different place now. The street was empty, the air colder, and the ground beneath me was cracked. There were no more stalls. The sign that had once read "Market" now said something else. The word was blurry, unreadable. I looked down at my hand. In it was a small jar, its glass cool to the touch. Inside, a tiny figure, trapped and staring back at me, its eyes wide, pleading, just like the others. I didn't know when I had taken it. I didn't know how it had come to be in my hand. But I knew, with a certainty that gripped my soul, that I would never leave this place. I was one of them now. It was a quiet evening when I found myself standing before the monument. The one I had passed by countless times in the years I'd lived in this town. The monument was simple, tall, gray stone, surrounded by trees and a winding path that led through the park. It had been here as long as I could remember, a landmark of sorts, though I never gave it much thought. People had left flowers or notes, their names and messages carved into the stone, reminders of loved ones long gone. But that evening, something felt different. There was an odd weight in the air, a quiet, palpable stillness that hung over the park, making the evening seem unnaturally silent. The wind barely stirred the trees, and even the distant hum of traffic felt muffled, as though the world itself had slowed. I wasn't sure why I was here. I hadn't planned to stop, hadn't intended to linger, but something about the monument drew me in. As I approached, the dimming light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the stone. I noticed, as I had many times before, the various names carved into the surface names of the deceased, of people who had once been remembered here. Some were worn, faded by time, others fresh, recently etched into the surface, their edges still sharp and new. A sense of melancholy always clung to this place, but that evening, it was more than that. Something felt wrong. I reached out instinctively, brushing my fingers over the cool stone, feeling the uneven grooves of the names that had been carved into it over the years. Each name seemed to tell a story, a fragment of someone's life etched into this monument. But as I touched the surface, I felt a sudden chill in the air, a coldness that crept up my arm like a whisper of something unseen. I pulled my hand back, startled, but didn't think much of it. Perhaps it was the evening air, the shift in temperature as the sun dipped below the horizon. But then, as I stepped closer, I saw it. At the very top of the monument, almost hidden beneath the canopy of overhanging branches, a new name had been carved. It was fresh, newly etched into the stone, its edges still rough, the lines dark and deep against the weathered surface of the monument. I leaned in closer, squinting in the fading light, and my stomach dropped as I read the name. It was mine. My heart skipped a beat, a cold rush of panic flooding my chest. I recoiled slightly, unsure of what I had just seen. It couldn't be. I stepped back, taking a few shaky breaths, trying to steady myself. But when I looked again, The name was still there, clear, unmistakable, carved into the stone. Your name. I reached for my phone, fumbling with it in the dim light, trying to check the time, trying to ground myself, but my hands were trembling. My reflection appeared in the dark screen for a brief moment, pale and wide-eyed, and I stared at it for a second too long. I shook my head, trying to push the absurdity of it away, but the sense of unease only deepened. I stepped closer again, my breath quickening, my thoughts racing. How could this be? Had someone played a prank, carved my name in some misguided joke? I touched the stone again, feeling the roughness of the edges, the coolness of the surface. But it was real, undeniably real. The stone didn't feel fake, didn't feel like part of a prank. It felt ancient, solid, permanent. As my fingers traced the name, a wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stepped back, clutching my head. The coldness of the monument seeped into me, pressing against my chest. I looked around, but the park was still empty. No one had seen me. No one had heard me. My heart raced as I looked down the path I had walked to get here, but everything seemed wrong. The trees were too still, the shadows too deep. The park, which usually felt peaceful, now felt like a trap. A sense of dread twisted in my stomach, tightening with each passing second. I turned back to the monument, my mind struggling to understand what was happening. I had no memory of ever being near it before that moment. Why had I felt compelled to stop? Why had I not noticed the name earlier, when it had clearly been freshly carved? Then it happened. As I stared at the stone, a flicker of movement caught my Aja shadow, moving just behind the monument. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The park, once again, was still, lifeless. Yet something remains, just out of sight. A sensation, a feeling that I was being watched. I turned back to the monument, my hands still shaking as I reached for it again. But this time, something was different. The stone beneath my fingers felt warmer, as if the name had just been carved a few seconds ago. I stepped back in shock. It couldn't be. The name was shifting, the letters changing ever so slightly, as though they were adjusting, molding to something new. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, helpless, as the edges of the carving softened, reshaping themselves. The stone seemed to pulse with energy, as if alive, as if the monument were reacting to my presence. My name, which had seemed so innocent before, now felt sinister, and I could feel the weight of it pressing into me. I turned and ran. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't stop my legs from moving faster as I fled down the path. The park blurred around me, the trees bending as I passed, the shadows stretching longer and longer, reaching out to touch me. I heard nothing behind me, no footsteps, no voices, only the sound of my breath and the rush of blood in my ears. The park, the monument, my name, everything felt wrong, like I was being pulled into something from which there would be no escape. I didn't stop running until I reached the street, my lungs burning, my body shaking with fear. I turned around, once, glancing back at the entrance to the park. It looked normal again, peaceful, untouched. But I knew better. I knew that something had changed. Something had marked me, tied me to that monument in a way I couldn't understand. And as I stood there, gasping for air, I couldn't help but wonder if the name was still there, carved in stone, waiting for me to return. The carnival had been closed for hours. The once vibrant lights had faded, and the usual sounds of laughter, music, and the clattering of rides had long since been replaced by the eerie quiet of an abandoned fairground. It was an overcast evening, the sky thick with the promise of rain, but for now the air was cool and still. The breeze carried a faint smell of cotton candy, mingled with the sharp scent of metal and damp wood. I had wandered into the carnival grounds after taking a late night walk through the city, finding myself drawn to the empty lot that had once been alive with energy. I wasn't sure why I'd come, exactly. Perhaps it was nostalgia for the summers of my childhood, the bright lights and sounds that filled the air with a sense of magic. Or perhaps it was the eerie quiet that had drawn me in, how the darkness made the place seem almost foreign now, as if the carnival were a ghost of itself. The only sounds now were the soft creaking of the rusting Ferris wheel in the wind, and the distant groan of the roller coaster track, swaying in the breeze like it was remembering the excitement it once held. I walked past the food stalls, their windows covered in dust, the faint traces of old popcorn and spilled soda still visible on the counters. I was about to turn back when I saw it, the carousel. It stood at the far end of the lot, its colorful horses and animals still frozen in place, their painted eyes wide and staring out into the empty space. The carousel was always the highlight of the carnival for me when I was a child. The whirry of the machine and the lights flashing brightly, giving life to the wooden horses as they spun in a circle. But tonight, everything was still. The horses were locked in place, as if caught in a moment before they were meant to start. I didn't know why I felt compelled to walk toward it, but something about its silence, its stillness, called to me. I stepped closer, the gravel beneath my shoes crunching softly. I felt an unsettling chill as I approached the ride. The lights above the carousel were dim, their colors muted by the heavy clouds, but they still flickered in a sporadic rhythm, casting strange shadows across the faded horses. It almost looked like the carousel had been forgotten, abandoned in the middle of the night, left to decay alone under the sky. As I got closer, I saw her. She was sitting on one of the carousel horses, her back straight, her hands resting on the edges of the saddle. She was dressed in a simple white dress, her long hair falling softly around her shoulders, the kind of image you might expect from a lost soul, out of place in such an eerie setting. She didn't seem to notice me at first, her gaze locked on the ride's stillness. She looked almost serene, perfectly still, as though she belonged there, even though the carousel hadn't moved in what felt like hours. I paused, unsure if I should approach her or turn back. It was late, and something about her presence seemed unnatural, like she didn't belong in this world of silence. I watched her for a moment longer. There was something wrong about the way she sat, how she was completely motionless, as if the world had forgotten her. Then, my breath caught when I realized the carousel itself was not just still, it wasn't even turned on. There was no hum of machinery, no sound of the motor beneath the wooden structure. The ride was silent, empty, as if it hadn't been in use for years. The girl turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting mine. Her gaze was calm, like she had known I was there the entire time. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, but there was something hollow in them, something that unsettled me, as if she were waiting for me to notice something I wasn't quite ready to see. She didn't speak, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of her gaze, as though it was digging into me. The quiet was thick, unbearable. And then, I saw something strange. Slowly, so slowly that I wasn't sure I had imagined it, the carousel's horses began to move. It was a subtle shift at first, a slight rocking, a creaking of the ancient wooden frames, but it was enough to make my heart leap into my throat. I looked at the girl. She hadn't moved, but the movement was becoming more pronounced now. The horses turned gently in a circle, but it was different from before. The movement was slow, almost deliberate, as if someone was forcing the carousel to work. And then, in the dim light, I saw something else on one of the horses. The wooden figure of a rider began to shift. A slow, jerky movement. The wooden rider's head turned, just a fraction, in my direction. The motion wasn't natural. It was stiff, too calculated, like the figure wasn't supposed to move at all. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I could hear the faint creak of wood against metal, the wheels beginning to turn, but there was no joy in the movement. No laughter, no excitement, just an eerie, mechanical motion that felt wrong. I took a step back, my legs suddenly weak, but the girl on the horse didn't move. She remained still, watching me with that same unsettling calm. Her lips parted slightly as if she was about to speak, but no words came. I turned, ready to leave, but before I could take another step, I heard a sound, a whisper, faint but clear. It came from the girl, from the ride, from the very air around me. "Come closer," she said, her voice soft and cold, like the wind before a storm. I hesitated, a wave of fear crashing over me, but something about her voice, so quiet and insistent, rooted me to the spot. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that carousel as possible, but my body refused to obey. I took another step toward her, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. The horses began to move faster now, the carousel creaking and groaning with each turn, but there was no music, no sound of children's laughter. The entire ride had become distorted, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. The girl on the horse hadn't moved, but the shadows around her seemed to pulse, like they were alive, waiting. And then, without warning, she smiled. It wasn't a gentle smile. It was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face, as though the edges of her lips were being pulled against her will. Her eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, fixed on me as the carousel sped up, the horses turning in a blur, faster and faster, until the world around me seemed to spin. I could hear the faint sound of music now, but it wasn't a melody I recognized. It was dissonant, strange, like a broken tune, echoing through the hollow space of the carnival. The ground beneath me seemed to shake, the air growing colder. And I realized with a sickening jolt that I was no longer standing where I had been. I was standing at the edge of the carousel, looking into the girl's eyes, trapped in the movement, drawn in by the chaos of the ride. "Stay," she whispered again, her smile too wide to knowing. "It's just beginning." I wanted to scream, to run, to get away from this nightmare, but I couldn't move. The carousel spun faster, the figures on the horses twisting in, their seats, their wooden faces distorted, their eyes following me. The girl on the horse grinned wider, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that I wasn't meant to leave. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the carousel stopped. The horses halted in place, the ride grinding to a halt. But the girl's smile remained. I was standing at the edge of the ride, unable to move, unable to escape the stillness that had consumed the air. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, watching the girl on the horse, her eyes still fixed on me. I wanted to leave, but the ride the whole park had become part of me now, part of the endless cycle that I couldn't escape. The lights flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the entire carousel into darkness. But I could still feel her eyes, and I could hear the soft sound of the horses turning again, slowly, patiently, waiting for someone else to come. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never truly leave. I hadn't planned on going to the mall that evening. It was well past the usual closing time, and the rain outside had begun to fall in sheets, thick and heavy, tapping against the windows like an impatient visitor. I'd only needed to return something I'd bought earlier in the day, something trivial, and I thought I'd get it done quickly. The mall was already dark, and most of the stores had their metal gates drawn, but the sliding doors were still open, and I figured I could get in and out without a problem. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I walked through the empty corridors, the floor tiles glistening under the dim lighting. I passed a few closed kiosks, their displays covered in plastic sheeting, and the occasional security guard in the distance, his figure a quiet shadow against the endless row of shut shops. The air inside the mall was cool, artificial, tinged with the faint scent of freshly mopped floors and the lingering perfume of the stores. It should have been peaceful, quiet, a perfect moment of solitude in an otherwise busy world, but something about the emptiness gnawed at me. I made my way to the store I needed. There were no other customers around, and the quiet seemed louder in the absence of voices. The distant hum of the mall's ventilation system, the only sound filling the space. I glanced at my watch. 9:45 p.m. I would be in and out in just a few minutes, a simple errand. But as I stepped inside, I felt the unmistakable weight of stillness pressing in on me, almost like the walls themselves were breathing, waiting. The store was already darkened for the night, the only light coming from the faint glow of the exit sign above. The air felt cooler here, and the aisles seemed wider than they should have been, as though the store had expanded beyond the realm of normal perception. The few clothes hanging on the racks swayed ever so slightly, though I couldn't explain why. The lights above flickered, then hummed to life, casting their sterile glow across the displays. A few minutes passed as I picked up the item I needed, and when I turned to head toward the exit, something changed. The lights flickered again, but this time, they didn't come back on. Instead, they cut out entirely. I froze for a moment, my mind racing to make sense of it. The emergency lights should have come on automatically. The mall was supposed to be well lit until closing, after all. Yet, all that surrounded me was a deep, consuming blackness. My breath caught in my throat as the darkness enveloped the store, thick and absolute. I stood still, trying to listen, trying to gauge if anyone else was still here. If perhaps I was just imagining the quiet that stretched into the corners of my mind. But there was no sound, no movement, no voices, nothing. I fumbled for my phone in the dark, pulling it from my pocket, but the screen was dead. Dead. It was fully charged when I left the house. I pressed the button again, desperately, but it remained unresponsive. Panic bubbled up inside me. The coldness of the air had shifted to it had become sharper, colder, and it pressed against my skin like fingers reaching out, grabbing me. I turned slowly, moving toward the faint outline of the exit door, but the distance seemed further than it should have been. I reached the door, only to find that it wouldn't open. I pushed against it, but the handle didn't budge. The panic rose higher now, a tightness in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I pressed my face against the cool glass, trying to see outside, but all I could see was a deep black void. The rain was still falling heavily, but it felt as though I were looking into a place where the weather couldn't reach. As though the world had ended, leaving only this mall and me behind. I stepped back, my hands shaking, my mind spinning. The darkness felt wrong. The hum of the lights had gone completely now, leaving only the strange silence. The emergency exit signs above the doors blinked dimly, casting faint shadows on the floor, but they, too, seemed weak, flickering as though on the verge of fading out. I turned around again, my pulse quickening. There were no security guards, no staff members, nothing. Just the rows of empty, still stores, their windows dark. The entire mall felt abandoned, but the strange thing was that it didn't feel like the end of the day. It felt trapped, and then I heard it. A faint sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, footsteps. I stopped, my breath catching, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from somewhere deep within the mall, echoing off the walls, like a distant, slow march. It grew louder, but it wasn't the sound of someone rushing to turn the lights back on, or someone running for help. It was slow, deliberate, as if whoever was walking wanted me to hear them. They were moving toward me, but I couldn't see them, couldn't even place which direction they were coming from. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for something, anything to steady myself, and in that instant, the lights came back on. Everything was as it should have been. The lights above buzzed to life, casting their harsh glow over the familiar displays. The store looked as it had when I first entered, shelves stocked, clothes neatly arranged, nothing out of place. Even the exit door in front of me was open, as though it had never been locked. I stepped back, confused, trembling, and looked around. The footsteps, the sound of someone moving through the darkness, they were gone. The mall was silent again. I glanced at my phone. The screen was working now, the battery fully charged. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of a janitor's cart rolling down the hall. I didn't know if I had imagined it, all the dark, the footsteps, the strange oppressive silence that had filled the air, but when I stepped out into the mall, everything seemed to normal. To normal in the way that a place seems after you've left it and come back, when you're not sure if what you experienced was real. I left quickly, my footsteps loud against the tiled floor, and as I stepped outside, the air felt fresher, as though I had just been released from a pressure I hadn't known I was under. The night had cleared, the rain was gone, and the world felt like it had resumed. But I knew I wouldn't forget the feeling, the heavy stillness, the footsteps that came from nowhere, the lights that flickered and buzzed. Something about the mall had changed, and I knew it had been watching me. And sometimes, when I walk past it now, I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to come in. To hear the footsteps, and the silence, and to find that the lights have gone out once again. It was late afternoon when I decided to visit the park, a habit I had grown accustomed to over the years. The weather had been dreary, a thick layer of gray clouds blanketing the sky, and the air had a damp chill to it. The kind of cold that settles deep into your bones. I knew it would be quiet, the kind of peace I needed after a long week of work. The park was always my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in nature, in the sounds of birds, in the hum of distant traffic that seemed muffled by the trees. The park itself was an old one, with cobblestone paths, ancient trees, and the occasional statue. At the heart of it stood the fountain, a grand feature that had been there for as long as I could remember. It was a beautiful thing, with water cascading from the mouth of a stone lion, its roar captured forever in stone. People often sat by it, fed the pigeons, or read books on the benches that lined the square around it. It was a place of life, of motion, and I had always enjoyed coming to it until that day. I walked toward the fountain, drawn by its familiar presence. As I approached, I noticed something was off. The usual sound of water splashing and flowing so constant, so soothing was absent. In its place was an eerie silence, so complete that it made my steps feel unnaturally loud. The stone lion was still, its mouth open as if caught mid-roar, but there was no water. The basin that usually caught the spray was dry, cracked at the edges, and the water was nowhere to be found. It was as though the fountain had ceased to exist, or at least had been drained, leaving only a dry, lifeless shell. I stopped, staring at it. My thoughts were a blur. Why would the fountain be empty? It had never stopped flowing before. There was no sign of maintenance, no workers around. I reached out and touched the stone edge of the fountain, feeling the cold texture under my fingertips. The air felt heavier here, thicker, as though something was pressing against me. I shivered. Despite the cold, my breath shallow as I glanced around. There was no one else in the park. It was just me, and this inexplicable stillness. I took a step closer, feeling the weight of the silence settle deeper into my chest, and that's when I noticed it. The surface of the stone, where the water had always rippled and splashed, was now perfectly still, but there was something odd about it. In the absence of water, the surface of the stone seemed to reflect something I hadn't expected, my own reflection. At first, I thought it was just the angle, the fading light playing tricks. But then I saw it clearly, the reflection of myself, standing by the fountain, staring back at me. My image was so perfect, so precise, that it sent a shiver down my spine. But something wasn't right. The reflection didn't move the way I did. It wasn't in sync with my movements. It was just there. I froze, my eyes locked onto my reflection. It stared back at me, its expression calm, eerily serene, but I could feel the difference. It wasn't just the way my movements had slowed down, it was the way the reflection lingered after I moved. It held itself there a second longer, as if waiting for me to notice. I took a step back, my heartbeat quickening. This was ridiculous, I told myself. Of course, it was just a trick of the light, or maybe some imperfection in the stone. But as I moved, my reflection stayed. It didn't follow me immediately. It lagged, just for a moment, and when it finally caught up, it did something that made my blood run cold. The reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was wide, too wide, the corners of its mouth stretching far beyond what was natural, its eyes wide open, unblinking. It wasn't a smile of joy or contentment. It was something else, something wrong. A smile that should not have been there. Something born of an awareness that didn't belong in the stone. I stumbled back, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I turned quickly, walking away from the fountain, my breath shallow. But as I turned, I could feel the pressure. The weight of the reflection still following me, locked in the stone, watching me leave. The sense of being observed, of being trapped by something outside of myself, clawed at the edges of my mind. I walked toward the park gates, trying to escape the nagging feeling that something had changed, that something was watching me. I passed the same old trees, the same benches, but the world felt different now, as though it were made of glass and I had cracked it. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, but it felt like I was underwater, the sounds muffled and distant. I reached the gates and stepped out onto the street, but the unease followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the reflection had never really left the fountain. It stayed there, waiting, a silent witness to everything. I did everything I said. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the fountain, to the stone lion, to that perfect, wrong reflection that hadn't been mine. I pulled the covers up over my head, hoping that would block out the memory, but the feeling of eyes, my own eyes, unblinking, too wide remained. I kept seeing it in the dark corners of my room, in every reflective surface I passed. The bathroom mirror, the window, the gleam of my phone screen. I could feel it watching me, always just a step behind. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of water splashing, as though the fountain has begun to flow again, quietly, softly, and when I open my eyes, I swear I can see the faint outline of my reflection, waiting in the stone, smiling that same wide smile, still frozen, still watching. The park was quieter than usual that afternoon, as though the wind itself had decided to take a break. The trees were still, their leaves hanging heavy and lifeless, dripping from the rain earlier in the morning. I had come to this park countless times before, an old, sprawling space with winding paths, benches, and the towering statue at the center that always felt slightly out of place. The statue, a tall figure of a man in flowing robes, eyes cast downward as if in thought, was one of those relics that had been part of the park long before I arrived. It was, to put it simply, a fixture, always present, but never the center of attention. That day, though, it caught my eye in a way it never had before. I was walking along the edge of the fountain when I first noticed her. She was sitting on one of the nearby benches, her gaze fixed on the statue across from her, the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing almost the only sound in the quiet park. Her features were soft and calm, but something about the way she stared at the statue made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an undeniable pull toward her. I turned away for a moment, distracted by the fountain's gentle spray, but when I looked back, her eyes hadn't moved. She still stared directly at the statue, unwavering, as if locked in some kind of trance. The air seemed heavier, almost suffocating, in the stillness, and I found myself walking toward her without meaning to. As I neared, I hesitated. There was something almost unnatural in the way she was fixated on the statue. Her eyes wide, unblinking, focused on the figure as if willing it to move. I stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to speak or just move on. But then, something happened. The statue shifted. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure, which had been still as stone for as long as anyone could remember, had moved just slightly. The head once lowered in contemplation had turned, almost imperceptibly, as though it had heard something, as though it had noticed her. My heart skipped a beat. The woman, still seated, seemed to be waiting, her lips barely parted in a strange, serene expression, as though she knew what would happen next. The statue turned again, this time a little further, until it was facing the woman directly. I could feel my pulse quickening as I watched this happen, the movement so slow, so deliberate, that it seemed wrong, unnatural. It was as if the statue wasn't just reacting to her gaze, it was responding to it. I looked back at her, half expecting her to stand or speak, but she remained perfectly still, her eyes locked with the statue's now fully turned face. There was an eerie calm about her, as if she knew something I didn't. She didn't seem surprised, or frightened, or even remotely disturbed by the fact that a statue that had been unmoving for decades was now staring back at her. My thoughts were a blur. I wanted to run, to scream, to somehow break the spell that had taken hold of the park, but I couldn't move. The air around me felt thick, charged, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. The statue's stone face, now so unnervingly human, locked eyes with hers, and I felt an almost suffocating pressure in my chest. It was as if the moment itself was expanding, stretching into something larger, something inevitable. Then, just as quickly as it had turned, the statue's head snapped back into its original position, the one it had held for decades, unmoving, staring down at the base of its pedestal. The woman's gaze never faltered. She simply sat there, as if nothing had happened, her eyes still locked onto the stone figure. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, my body screaming at me to leave, to escape the heaviness of the air, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The woman's eyes finally shifted from the statue, her expression serene, almost satisfied. She looked at me, her gaze as piercing as it had been when she stared at the figure, and I saw something strange in her eyes. There was no surprise, no shock at what had just occurred. Only an almost knowing calm, like she had expected the statue to move all along. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. She smiled gently, the corners of her lips curling upward in a slow, deliberate motion. "It's only a matter of time," she whispered, her voice soft, almost melodic, as though she were speaking to herself. "Everything has its moment. Everything responds when it's ready." I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I didn't want to be part of this moment. I wanted to leave, to run as far as I could, but my legs felt heavy. The park, the bench, the woman, they all seemed to blur around me, as though the world had become something I could no longer fully grasp. I turned and started to walk quickly, faster than I'd intended, my eyes locked on the path ahead. I dared not look back at the woman, at the statue. or at anything else in the park that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air felt oppressive, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had been waiting for me to witness it. As I left the square behind, the sound of footsteps was the only thing I could hear my own echoing. Through the empty streets, the rain had stopped, but the weight of what I had seen lingered. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just a trick of my mind, a strange coincidence that I had imagined in my tired state. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The statue had moved, and I couldn't forget that eerie smile of hers, as if the world had shifted for her, as if she had somehow made it happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her again sitting so still, staring at the statue, waiting. And I wondered if that was the only time it would happen, or if, in the stillness of the night, it would happen again. Even now, I avoid that part of the park. I don't go near the square, and sometimes, when I walk past, I catch a glimpse of the statue from a distance sits, stone face cold and unmoving. But every time, I swear I feel it watching me, and I wonder, with a shiver that runs deep into my bones, if the next time I look, it might turn its head again. It was late when I stepped out into the square, the rain having long since stopped, leaving only the faintest hint of moisture in the air. The cobblestones beneath my feet were damp, reflecting the yellow glow of the distant streetlights in long, jagged lines. A few people drifted past, walking hurriedly, their heads down, umbrellas tucked under their arms, shadows passing swiftly across the square. I paused in the center, inhaling the cool air, letting it fill my lungs. It was a usual evening, peaceful end to a busy day, or so I thought. The square was familiar to me. I'd walked through it countless times, had stood in its center during countless nights, waiting for trams or buses, or simply walking home after work. But tonight was different. I couldn't explain why, but there was something in the air, a subtle shift. Something off about the way the shadows stretched, the way the lights flickered on the street lamps. I stood still, taking in the quietness, trying to shake the feeling of unease. It was as if the world had grown slightly more muted, as if everything were holding its breath. I tried to brush it aside, to continue my routine, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the stillness. The square was quiet, but not the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was heavier, almost suffocating. I turned slowly, scanning the empty benches, the market stalls that had already closed, the quiet doorways leading into shops. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, but the air didn't feel right. I stepped forward, my footsteps muffled by the damp stone beneath me. As I walked, I realized that I wasn't hearing the usual sounds of the city, no distant car horns, no chatter from nearby groups, no hum of streetlights, just an oppressive silence that wrapped around me like a blanket. I reached the middle of the square. That's when I noticed it. The people, they had stopped moving. It was subtle at first. At the edge of my vision, I noticed that the figures passing by weren't moving at the same pace as they should. I tried to focus on one, but when I did, the image became distorted, as though the people were frozen in place, but with some strange delay. I glanced again. There, across the square, a couple stood frozen in mid-conversation. Their hands were lifted, the woman's mouth open mid-sentence. I could hear nothing. They were perfectly still. I froze myself, my heart beginning to pound. I looked around quickly, scanning the square. The benches, the shop windows, the trees, they were all normal, but the people had stopped. Not all of them, just a few. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe my mind playing tricks after a long day. But the more I looked, the more I noticed it. The people who had once moved were now statues, caught in a moment. Their eyes fixed on a point I couldn't see, their bodies suspended in frozen animation. I took a step forward, hesitant, and immediately regretted it. The world felt different now, off-kilter, as though I had entered a place that shouldn't exist, a world where time itself had stopped. I tried to call out, to ask someone what was happening, but my voice sounded muffled, like I was speaking underwater. The silence in the square felt thick, almost suffocating. I walked toward the nearest figure, a man standing near a bench, his face halfway turned as if he were about to speak. His lips were parted, but no sound came from him. I stood in front of him, staring, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. His eyes stared straight ahead, his posture unnervingly still. I began to feel a rising panic, something deep inside telling me to move, to run, but my legs felt like they had become part of the stone, anchored to the ground. I could still see movement in the reflections of the shop windows, the distorted figures, flickering in the glass, as if there was something beyond the reflection I couldn't see clearly. I turned away, focusing on the sound of my own breathing. The only thing that seemed real in the overwhelming silence, and that's when it happened. I felt it first, a shift in the air, like a pressure growing, subtle but undeniable. And then, I heard it, the faintest rustle, a soft sound almost like a whisper. I turned, immediately, searching for its source, but the square remained still, its frozen inhabitants unmoving, their eyes fixed on an empty point. But then, I saw her. She was standing near the fountain, her face partially obscured by a dark scarf, her body still, yet somehow different from the others. There was an odd quality to her presence, as though she were both part of the world and not part of it. She was watching me, her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt as though I wasn't just being observed, I was being waited on. She tilted her head slightly, almost as if acknowledging something I couldn't understand. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a cautious step toward her, drawn by an instinct I couldn't explain. She didn't move, didn't blink. But I could feel her attention growing, like a magnetic force pulling me closer. Her eyes never left mine, and her lips curled into a faint smile, one that seemed too wide, too knowing. Suddenly, a thought flashed in my mind. It was absurd, but it struck me nonetheless. What if I stood still? What if I froze, just like everyone else? I wanted to try it, to see if the world would shift again, or if the silence would lift. But the moment I thought of standing still, everything around me seemed to freeze even further. The air turned colder, and I realized the gravity of the moment. The woman's smile stretched wider, her expression unblinking, unwavering, and then, with an unsettling suddenness, she began to step forward, slowly, silently. Her feet didn't even seem to touch the ground. She glided across the square, moving toward me with a patient grace that was almost terrifying. I wanted to run. I turned, desperate, looking for an escape, but the square remained the same, frozen, stretched, suspended in time. No movement, no sounds. The buildings around me seemed to lean inward, as if the entire space were becoming smaller, more oppressive. I turned back to the woman, her eyes now inches from mine, her smile far too wide. My breath caught in my throat. Her face was so close that I could feel her presence, so close that it felt like she was inside my mind, her smile now stretching unnaturally. Too wide, far too wide for any human face to manage. I could hear her now, the whisper that had started as a rustling, now a voice, faint and melodic. You're part of it now. You always have been. I stumbled backward, but the world around me warped, the edges of the square blurring into shadow. The woman reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt it cold, electric, like the air had frozen in place. I gasped, trying to pull away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, anchored in place, just like the others. And then, as if the world had finally decided, the square shifted. The people returned to life, their motions jerking forward like they had been waiting for permission. But the woman was gone. The square was bustling again, normal. But for me, it was no longer the same. I could feel the weight of her eyes still upon me, even though she was no longer there. I tried to move. I tried to run, to leave, but I found that I couldn't. The square had changed, and I was still a part of it, locked in its quiet, patient stillness. I felt the weight of it, all those eyes, that smile, and the eerie whisper pressing against me, knowing that whatever had happened there had never really ended. And as the world continued to shift and move around me, I understood one thing. I was no longer just a passerby. I was a part of the square, of the shadows, of the silence, and there was no escaping it.